Hi, John. How are you? And welcome to all of our listeners. This is the fifth episode of Hybrid Chats. Who would have thought that we'd get there? When we first recorded this, I was sitting right in this seat in our Dublin office, and we talked briefly, and we've had four more episodes, and here we're on the fifth one. So today I am in Dublin, in the office, which is funny to talk about remote and hybrid work when I sit in office, but that's hybrid, right? You choose where you sit. Where are you, John?
Well, it's very interesting that you say that because I would be a firm believer in remote and office because I think there's a space for both. But today I am in a very remote part of the country. I'm about 3 kilometers from Mizenhead in West Cork, and I'm in a wonderful situation where I have a very nice 1 gig broadband fiber down here, plus 5G all around the area, which just shows the extent to which you can work in a distributed manner and can work remote from an office. And I think today is a really good microcosm of remote and office.
Absolutely. And it's funny because we were looking at each other's internet speeds just to make sure that this goes smoothly. And we figured out that me in the city center of Dublin have about three times less of a speed than you do in West Cork. So that tells
Correct.
you everything. And it's interesting that we start this way because as you see in all the articles that we'll cover today, there definitely seems like a lot of hybrid in everything we're going to cover, from the prospects of what people want, from the
Yeah.
prospects of what's actually working well for companies. So we'll cover all that. But before we start, for those of you that have never seen these two faces, I'm Irina Jampazova. I'm the head of communications of Boundless. And with me, I have John Reardon, chairman of Grow Remote. And myself and John meet once a month, wherever we may be in the world. And we talk about everything that's come out in the last month in terms of articles, in terms of studies, in terms of opinions. Around remote work, hybrid work, flexible work, and what should we do, what should we not do. Certainly, having done this for a few months now, there's no
Mm-hmm.
shortage. Any month, and this month is no different. So, shall we kick off, John?
Yeah, please do.
Perfect. So, the first thing we're going to talk today about is a study that was published in the Stanford Institute of Economic Policy. And the authors are three scholars based in it. One of them, I feel like I want to say a good friend of ours. I've never met Nick Bloom. Maybe you have, but because we talk about him every time, it feels like he's a good friend. But basically, they did a study on remote work, working from home. It's been 3 years and plus since the onset of the pandemic. So what they discovered is that work from home has increased by 500% since 2019. Fully remote work is cost effective, but may lead to a bit of a drop in productivity. And we're going to touch on this in a second. And hybrid work improves retentions without productivity loss. And they have the full expectation that work from home will continue this trajectory. But before I share more of the data in the study, which I highly recommend everyone reads, and we'll share it in the notes, John, what do you make of it?
In March 2020, when the curtain went down on all of us, there was the best way to describe what happened was it was a pandemic knee-jerk reaction or a knee-jerk reaction to the pandemic, and people had literally no warning and scuttled home, had no choice, and tucked in some cases a desktop, not even a laptop, under their arm, and went home and made do as best they could. And there are all sorts of stories out there about people using an ironing board as a desk, people sitting in cupboards and with dodgy Wi-Fi and all that kind of stuff. So they're all the edge case stuff that happened in March 2020. There's a level of maturity that's been brought about to that. But one thing that really needs to be addressed here, Irina, is intent. there's an awful lot of people who are working from home, where the intent has not been properly set by the employer, where the intent is we are going to provide the best work conditions for somebody to work in a distributed manner. And that's a really important point for people to understand. There was some research that came out just came out this morning from the same group, Jose Maria Barrero, Nicholas Bloom, and Stephen Davis, who are the three folks who drive the most of the commentary from Stanford under the banner of WFH Research. And work from home is a bit of a misnomer, because it's about 60% of the people who actually if you take people who answered that they weren't in the office working in any one period of time, 60% of those people are at home. Approximately 20% of people are in a co-working space. 15% are in a cafe or in a public. Sorry, 20 are in a public place. 15 are in a co-working spot, and the balance are in a friend's house or a relative's house. So really, what that says to me is that we should not just refer to this blanket term work from home. We need to refer to it as just not being in the office. So clearly, over the course of the next couple of years, people are going to solidify the place where they're going to work, and it may well be multiple places. So, for example, when I was working from home full time, I would always try to have what I referred to as a pressure release valve, and I would try to spend at least a half a day a week going to a local coffee shop or going to a co-working place, just to get out of the house, just to scratch that community itch, to be around people. So that's a very important thing to create intent. Going back to the research, the question that you asked, some of the commentary regarding drop in productivity, there's a lot of caveats on that. The research says it may lead to productivity decline. And the part that's said to may lead to productivity decline are roles that are fully remote, more than hybrid. And we all know that there are people who have been put in a situation where they're working from home fully, where they may not want to be working from home, and they haven't been given the level of flexibility to do what I just described, which is to actually have what I would call discretion over where they could be. So what it's all leading back to is the second comment that you made regarding hybrid. And hybrid is actually the area that is of most interest, because there's really about 15% of people working from home. There's a portion of people who are fully in office, and then there's this big chunk in the middle working hybrid. And the hybrid thing is, it's coming out to about 2.5 to 3 days a week, which is a really good number to get to. Employers are looking for it to be closer to 2. Employees are looking for it to be closer to 3. Then we're arbitraging that gap. And that seems to be the sweet spot where retention improves, where productivity is not lost. And I would suggest that is the arena that most employers and employees should play in that area around the 2.5 to 3 days a week. And I think that's the discussion that's going to be had over the course of the next couple of years regarding remote, office, and hybrid.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think it's funny, and maybe I'm extremely biased here. To me, hybrid equals freedom. But that's, I think, my version of hybrid. And we've certainly spoken about this before in previous episodes, that there is about 100 flavors of hybrid. Is it mandated? Is it not mandated? My version of it, as we've spoken about, is when I'm in Dublin, I come to the office pretty much 4 out of 5 days, unless it's lashing rain outside and I can't be bothered to come to the office. But then I go off to Athens for 7 weeks. So I'm technically working from home, just home happens to be something else, for this extended period of time. And if you look at my year, probably I come to the 2.5, 3 days a week because of where I spend extended periods of time. I think what I found really interesting in what they were saying when it comes to productivity is And I'm really curious about your opinion, because up until not long ago, you used to run a fully remote team in Shopify. One of the things they talk about is when it comes to working, if say working is being on calls or data crunching or something that is manually doing something where you don't need help from anyone, yes, you can be more productive because there's less distractions. The drop in productivity comes from when you run into a roadblock, and how that is resolved and how quickly it's resolved is a little bit slower, which causes this. And it is a thing of remote work. When you need help, it takes more time to
Yeah.
get that. So I'm curious about your thoughts, with kind of the hat of the person that used to run, quite a few hundred people at some point in Shopify.
Yeah. I think, I suppose the real, I'm going to reframe the question slightly. You're looking for the, what's a good perspective on productivity, and what are the things that I saw working at Shopify. Okay.
Absolutely.
The first thing is, and this is the type of thing that works at companies that are fully remote or are fully remote first. In other words, they lean in towards remote. The first key thing is documentation. When a question gets asked, if it gets answered in a text format, that answer lasts and can actually be used multiple times. If it's a one-on-one conversation between you and I, it's just your interpretation of what I said, and it goes away. It's gone. It's like vapor. It's gone. But if I write it down, there's the opportunity for somebody to actually enhance that answer and amplify that answer and build on it and grow on it, and it becomes essentially a playbook. So documentation is key. So that's number one. The second thing is, once you actually get into that habit of documenting and having a proper communications protocol, it leads into the next thing, which is what I would refer to as asynchronous communications. I am now respectful of the fact that I'm going to get the answer in writing, but what goes with that communication in writing is a time lag, and it's okay, because that affords the opportunity for people in the rest of the world, in the rest of the organization, to be able to see that answer being generated and being built on by other people. And in a large case, people respecting the fact that it might take 24 hours for the answer to fully build, comes around to the following day, and I see the answer. One or two people may have actually chimed in and given a fuller detail, a fuller kind of more global view. And that leads to a level of respect for my work-life balance. And you'll see companies like this are the types of companies where you'll see in somebody's e-signature, just because I sent this email at this time does not require you to read it. I want to be very aware of your time constraints and your timeline. So please get back to me at a time that suits you, or something along those lines.
That's lovely. That's great.
It's lovely, but it shows, what it shows is I'm respecting you.
Yeah.
And it's totally okay for you then to return that respect to me. Now, a lot of hardcore old style folks, office-based, kind of legacy thinking people would think that is all soft and all woke and all full of BS. But guess what? Many of the organizations now that are making waves and who are really progressing are companies where they take documentation very seriously. They take asynchronous communications very seriously. And the reason that those two are important is because they actually aid long-term productivity. And this leads into probably the most telling point, is that productivity, a lot of the studies that are out there are looking at productivity as a short-term measure. And I would say productivity is actually a long-term measure. And the reason why you need to think about it as a long-term measure is that productivity, without taking into account employee retention, is a measure that's really, really, it's a vacant measure, because productivity measures the short-term stuff. Retention measures the long-term stuff. You put the two of them together and it's a significantly enhanced measure. There's no point in driving really intense short-term productivity and churning people out, and then having a person or a whole department being almost gone while all those folks are gone and they have to be replaced. So productivity and retention together is a far better thing, and companies that focus on both of those measures are going to do very well in the long term.
It's such a good point, because I think we tend to take productivity as a standalone thing, and certainly, again, no shortage of debate out there, which is better, which is worse. And there's definitely the camp that says, no, 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 let's be back in the office. Productivity and innovation is better in the office. And one of the, on the funnier side of things, article, at least in its in the title, that we looked at this month, is called "The Forced Return to the Office is the Definition of Insanity." Now, I think you and I can sit here and judge the people that are really adamant on come back to the office, especially when we have all this data that kind of proves that the opposite is the better idea. But I think this is kind of beyond the point, and I think it's important to actually let's stop and think, because I don't think any of these people are insane. So there's other reasons, and I think it's important before we kind of start looking at the office camp being like, oh, these are insane people, we won't take them seriously. It's like, no, let's have a conversation. So what do you think is going on here? Like, why is there this demand, which from a data standpoint doesn't really make sense, from what employees want doesn't really make sense? So it must make sense somewhere. What do you think that is?
Well, the first thing we got to think about is look at it from a financial perspective. So assume you're the CFO of a company. One of the most important things that you need to do is to use the assets that the company has. And in many cases, that asset is either the physical asset of a building or the lease on a building. So you've got to sweat that asset. And a classic example, and I've used this before, is Apple spent an enormous amount of money on one of the most magnificent buildings that you'll ever come across out in Cupertino. And I would expect them to be trying to get as much value out of that building as possible. So they're going to sweat that asset. So I don't want to pillory or embarrass or give out or slag off companies that want to get the value from that investment. But we have to recognize that if those companies, if the clock rolled back to March 2020 and they were able to redefine the future, in all likelihood, that future would be without those very large assets that are encumbering them. So that's the first thing. You have to understand the reality of the hand that you've been dealt with. The second thing you got to look at is the age and demographic profile of the folks who are leading these organizations. Many of them have not worked in a let's call it a junior management or a senior management capacity, have not worked significantly from a remote or distributed organization. It just simply is the case, especially with the larger companies. And what that leads to is two key things, and these come up in the article that was written by Gleb Sipursky. First one is status quo bias. And this is something that a lot of leaders will lean into, which is, well, that's the way it always was. And I have this bias towards the status quo. And I want it to go back to the way it was. So you'll see a lot of people, even though it's 2023, they're trying to reimagine the office life and the collaboration that existed in 2019. When, and I've said this before when we've chatted, the smarter thing to do is to look at 2027 and aim towards 2027 rather than aim towards 2019. The other thing is this whole thing of another type of bias, which Gleb talks about in the article, is this functional fixedness bias, where you just assume that I don't even really want to go into the whole details of it because it's not an area that I'm fully familiar with, but this belief that that the old way of doing it, right, is the way that's actually going to work, because that's the way you know. And what I would say is a way to look at this is, as a leader or a want to be leader or a new leader, I would say, don't get blinded by people who are showing a lack of knowledge of working remote. Don't fall into the trap of not having intellectual curiosity. Be intellectually curious and try to get into the heads of, like, there's a reason why so many days a week are being worked from home, because for an awful lot of people it's working. So rather than shouting from the mountaintops to drag people back in, try to understand why it's working for those people. Get under the hood and understand it. And that's going to take, for some people, an element of bravery that may well have to go against the tide. And there's one interesting little point in all of this, is that most of the research, and particularly the research that Bloom, Barrero, and Stephen Davis have done in Stanford, there seems to be this kind of cutoff point of about 5,000 employees with about 5,000, or companies with 5,000 employees. Smaller companies tend to be far more attuned to remote work, but once companies get beyond 5,000 employees, they're way less likely to do it. Now, one thing that actually hasn't happened at all, Irina, which is really interesting, is we don't have enough time since March 2020 where a company has started small and built up to a certain level and then crossed 5,000. So that 5,000 number is kind of an arbitrary number that they've drawn and said that typically companies bigger than that aren't able to turn around and behave like a small company. What I think is going to be fascinating over the next 5 years is, as these smaller companies grow and grow and grow, will they turn and actually flip the way they're behaving? And I actually don't think they will. They will find ways to incorporate that level of flexibility, because that's what their employees will want. Imagine a situation where a company starts and grows very, very quickly, and then suddenly goes, oh, hang on, we're getting big now. We're now going to change the way we're working, and we're going to mandate that the majority of people need to come into the office. I personally don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, it's a really good one. It makes me think. Now, when you say the 5,000 number, there was that research that Gusto did, and in their findings, I think the cutoff point was the 5,000 people, and like the companies up to 5,000, and they basically looked at, from the ones that are 5,000 or under, 81% are either fully remote or some form of remote. They allow remote work, right? And then when you look at the bigger companies, especially the ones that appeared a few years ago as the zealots of, yes, absolutely, you can work remotely, forever, no mandates and stuff. Things have really changed. And there was an interesting article in Vox that was kind of talking about, the biggest perk seems to be freedom nowadays. And the small companies are using this perk. It's kind of comes free of charge. It's not a full stacked bar. It's not ping pong tables. And they're really gaining from that. And retention is better. They can hire more easily. There was one article itself had 3 different studies. That was basically proving that point. But then there is also the Gusto one, which looks at not only is it easier for them to hire and retain, but they actually looked at the performance of these companies. These companies are doing better. And at the same time, on the flip side of that, you have big tech that's kind of pretty much at this point, all of them have reversed their decisions. And also, did you know that apparently Google now has in-office presence as part of their performance evaluation?
Yeah, that's the one that it's a complete head scratcher to me. I mean, it is one of the most regressive steps I've seen for a long time. And I'm not quite sure their motivation. And I probably should lean in to find a little bit more information on it as to what the motivation of it is, but it seems to me to be a step back into the 2010s, and I don't really understand it. I mean, it really is accentuating this whole concept of presenteeism. I don't think it's going to end well for them on that front. But you know what? I'm quite happy to be wrong, but I don't think I will be on that one.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one, and then I think the article that was the Vox article that was talking about this was saying, there's other powers at play here where big tech feels like it needs to really act and appear as like very responsible, very mature, very grown up, which is funny because working remotely, firstly, is not immature or not grown up.
Mm-hmm.
But also, secondly, still big tech really needs to innovate, and it really needs to be, doing, treating its employees so they do their best. And I think we used to equate this to all the perks, the ping pong
Yeah,
tables, the meals 3 times a day. Nowadays, it's freedom, and that's a much harder
but
one to kind of invest in. Put the money, throw in the money in.
but let's make this very binary. Would you prefer to not have to commute and be able to work in an area that you're comfortable with, or have a forced commute but get a free lunch because of it? All right, and like when it comes down to as simple as that, and that's a very, very basic. That's an unnuanced, very basic way to phrase it. But when you phrase it like that, I think the resoundingly we're seeing employees going, "Hang on a second, I actually value." To your point, I value freedom rather than free food. Right, and it's a very, very
Yeah.
simple way of looking at it. Now, one other thing that comes up in all of this is that you see companies citing, and we've talked about productivity at the start, but companies also citing mentorship. Okay, and
Yes.
but
Yeah.
really, what's happening here, Irina, is a very interesting thing. Is companies are taking the mentorship methodology that existed in office, and they're trying to bang that square peg into a round hole of mentorship from a remote perspective. All right. Companies that have grown up in the remote world and grown up in a fully distributed way, mentorship is very structured. It's very intentional. There's time for it. It's really well structured. The flip side is you have companies saying, no, mentorship must be done in the office. So if you think of what they're saying we require you to be 40 hours a week in the office so that we can get that 1 or 2 hours of side-by-side time from a mentorship perspective. Doesn't make sense.
No.
And I think what we need to make sure is that we are doing our level best to share with larger organizations that are struggling with this, share with them the intentional focus on mentorship that's structured and intentional.
Completely agree with you, and I think that was one of the points that I got from the articles around, really hybrid just kept on coming as the one that makes more sense on this number of reasons, people, performance, and all that. And it got me thinking. Obviously we have on one side fully remote can be challenging because there is no FaceTime. The office, there is the FaceTime, but there isn't the intentionality because we're just making this assumption that just because we're all in the same space, somehow mentorship, innovation, what have you, will happen organically, right? And then there's hybrid that comes in between, whereas we have a bit of FaceTime, so that helps, on the fully remote side of things, it's better than that. But then because it's limited and because it's thought out, it also has the intentionality. So it becomes this formula for, oh, you want the same productivity or potentially better, have this. You need the FaceTime, but you also need the intentionality. So there we go. But
Absolutely agree.
what you and I also know is, for all the good things that we can say about hybrid, and the numbers are there, it still remains the hardest one to implement.
Oh,
And we've talked about this before. And there's one of the articles that we had this month. It's a study that McKinsey did. And in it, they interviewed, I believe, 50 executives. And these are people that want to do hybrid. They're trying to figure out how to do it right, and still they end up implementing only about a third of what McKinsey has kind of come up
Yeah.
with, like, oh, here's the 12 pillars of doing hybrid well. And only about a third of these are actually being done from these intentional companies, right? So there is a lot of work to be done with hybrid. And what they found is that these companies are not really leveraging workplace technology. They're not really creating work from anywhere systems. They're not really implementing test and measure systems. And to your point earlier, they're not really documenting things. So I suppose, again, you've kind of touched on this, but I suppose for the benefit of listeners, really, love to hear from you again. What are, if I'm someone listening to this and is like, okay, clearly it sounds like I should be doing hybrid. Aside from like having really good documents, what are other things that you recommend that people can do to really make hybrid work for them?
As an employer or a leader, first thing I would do is avoid mandates. Secondly, I would encourage and enable flexibility, which is the inverse of a mandate. And the reason for that is that smart, engaged employees will thrive and revel in an arena where they are being trusted to make smart decisions. I'm going to repeat that because it's really simple. Smart, engaged employees will thrive when they're trusted to make smart decisions.
I raise my hands to that.
It's a pretty obvious one.
Absolutely.
Another one is that there should never be this blanket approach of this is the way it's going to be in the company, because different teams, different departments, different functions, different divisions have different needs, and you need to respect those differences. There are organizations and companies where the classic one is payroll or talent acquisition, right? Where the majority of those type functions can be done fully remote all the time, very little need to be in an office, and they get cited on a regular basis. Then on the flip side, you'll see ones that get regularly cited as requiring collaboration are sales teams or marketing teams where they need to get involved from our product development. Yeah, so it differs by department, by company, by product type, by division. So respect those differences. Don't take a blunt instrument approach. Respect those differences. So really, to me, it's a case of infusing a culture where you have trust everywhere, where you have documentation as a core pillar, where you hold accountability fairly high. If I say I'm going to do it, I do it. And if I don't do it, I don't do it. And it's fairly black or white. And that's the beauty of it. I'm at home. I said I'll get it done. And if I didn't get it done, then I just didn't get it done. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Okay, it's simple.
Yeah.
And I think there's one other thing that underpins all of this is I would encourage companies to take a remote first approach. And remote first, all that means, I'm not saying remote only, but nor am I saying office only. I'm saying respect the fact that there are people who will not be in the office, and respect the fact that we need to have a democratic way in which who's at home, has the same access to everything as the person who's physically in the office. I have the same access to the senior people. I have the same access to the technology. So in other words, you and I are the same size box on a Zoom screen, and we should look at that is the most democratizing thing, as opposed to where I'm sitting in the conference room table. That's a crucially important point.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree with you. And, excellent points. So just to kind of finish off, I do want to bring a subject that I'm sure all of us see loads: commercial real estate. So if you look at media, okay, we've talked about remote and hybrid and in office, let's actually talk about what feels like the elephant in the room right now. Because if you look at media, if you look at your LinkedIn, it's the only thing that's being spoken about. So I picked up just three things, and I was trying to be very succinct. But in the Atlantic, we have an article that talks about property giants are defaulting on 1.5 trillion in loans that are due for repayment by 2025. And then in the Financial Times, we have only 10% of office buildings in New York are not distressed, meaning either in terms of level of debt or occupancy. And then in the Wall Street Journal, we have the claim that as a result, Wall Street is basically betting against American downtowns. So there's a part of me thinking, here we are, we're sitting, we're intellectualizing, oh,
Yeah.
hybrid or remote or office. Why are they wanting this? Why are they wanting that? Wow, there's like this, basically what a lot of people are saying, the next downturn, right? And it's like, should we even be, how bourgeois of us to be talking about, these philosophical points of how we should work? So, am I right? Or, and that's what I love about this conversation that we have with you, is should we actually think about, is this, I mean, it's obviously there's a problem, but is
Yeah.
there a little bit of scaremongering here that's
Yeah.
attempting to get people back in offices? What do you think?
Bad news sells far better than good news.
Yes.
And when people are screaming that the sky's falling in, it's a far better, it's a much easier way to get coverage. So you're going to have a lot of the scaremongering. Now, a lot of it is, is quite meaningful and quite distressing from a real estate perspective. And if I had a real estate portfolio, I would be exceptionally nervous. So like my LinkedIn thread remains every single day pretty full of articles talking about real estate and kind of a doomsday scenario for real estate. And I guess that probably 90% of the stuff that I'm seeing are predicting what you just said, this enormous and unprecedented downturn. So, you have to give some credence to that. But I would always say lean into the other 10%. There is a likelihood, and there is definitely significant evidence that A and B rated, the high end office complexes, new office complexes are actually doing quite well, because those companies that are choosing to actually be in the downtown world are actually spending the money to move up a level. So what's going to be first distressed is the lower grade office complexes in the CBD. So, there's always a way to flip a message around. So you could put out a headline which would be justifiable to say that A-rated buildings are doing Class A buildings are doing really, really well, and that is true. But some people would impute from that the real estate market is buoyant. I don't think it is. So, I think the articles and postings that aren't so negative are, and I'm going to use the term, they're imploring in nature, in that, to be honest with you, they're companies and CEOs who are begging or mandating employees to come back. And that's an interesting one, because what I've seen on a number of occasions in the last year is then I've seen other media outlets who are reporting on the headline that Elon Musk is mandating people coming back, and they're implying that now doesn't that mean that everybody's coming back? No. All you're doing is reporting on a headline of somebody asking people to come back, right? The fact, and this is where we need to go back to the research that the guys in Stanford are doing and in a lot of other places. The research shows that people are not coming back anywhere near at the pace that they're being implored to come back. The Castle information, which reflects card swipes in and out of buildings, relatively flat. The ridership in public transportation ridership is still below 70% of what it was pre-pandemic. So 30% of all people who would have gone into central business districts have disappeared. They're not there any longer. And just in case somebody'd say, well, then maybe they're not riding public transportation anymore. Well, actually, the cell phone usage is down 40% in central business districts. So they're not there. They're not traveling in there, and they're not there. So they just aren't there, which means that the real estate is now only has 60% or less of the usage that it was getting pre-pandemic. So it begs the question: how valuable is that real estate? Because it clearly is way less important and way less valuable to an industry, to companies. So it's hard to justify that expense. But then there's also the sunk cost fallacy, that if you actually have that, you need to try it as best you can, sweat that asset, which is a term I use on a regular basis. So I think the jury has rejected the premise that everybody needs to come back to the office. But is the corporate real estate market dead and dead forever? I don't think so. I think what I would say is there's an awful lot more to play out in this. But I, for one, would not be investing in corporate real estate. And I think there's a bigger shakeout to happen. It's not an area of expertise of mine, but I would be very nervous if I was long on real estate, but I'm not.
Good. Some investment decision here, investment advice from John as a bonus. But I think, yeah, ultimately we conclude where we usually conclude. As you're reading through things, take everything with a grain of salt and read through the entirety of surveys and data, and lean on the academic one, and be aware that there is some scaremongering, because I'm a journalism major. They do teach you in journalism school how to write titles that get more attention. So we're a little bit to blame. But anyways, it's a different conversation for a different time. John, thank you so much as always. Very, very interesting conversation. And as always, a reminder: if you, our listeners, would like to add any articles for us to review, talk about, claim as scaremongering or whatever it is, you can do that. We have now made it easier for you. We've created a big document in a platform called Coda, very similar to Notion for those that may have used that. All the articles that we not only talk about, but also kind of put in our list of articles to look through. We put all of them in there, so you can have access to that, even if we didn't talk about it. You can read back through them. But also there is a way for you to add articles there as well. There's a little button. So please share anything you want there, and John and I will be sure to cover it. In the meantime, thank you, John. Enjoy the west of Ireland. I hope it doesn't rain too much. And I'll talk to you next month. Thanks, Mel.
Great. Thank you very much.
Ciao.